When a narcissist discards you suddenly and cruelly, the first reflex is almost always self-interrogation. You replay every conversation, every gesture, every moment where you may have loved too much or hoped too sincerely, and you slowly begin to believe that somewhere there exists a mistake called you. But that logic only applies in relationships where two people are genuinely present. With a narcissist, that assumption is flawed at the foundation. In depth psychology, a relationship with a narcissist is not built on attachment, but on function. You are not loved for who you are, but for how well you help them maintain a fragile ego structure. You operate as a psychological mirror, reflecting worth, soothing shame, shielding emptiness, and keeping their persona intact before the world. As long as that mirror reflects correctly, the relationship continues. The problem does not begin when you do something wrong, but when you change, when you grow tired, when you ask questions, when you need real reciprocity, or when you begin to set boundaries. In Jungian terms, this is the moment the persona is no longer perfectly mirrored. Cracks appear, and through those cracks, the shadow begins to surface. For a psyche that has never integrated its shadow, this is not an invitation to heal, it is a threat to survival. That is why discard is not an emotional act, but a defensive reflex. The coldness does not come from strength, but from numbness. A narcissist is not internally safe enough to experience loss like an ordinary human being, because if they allowed themselves to feel grief or regret, the entire false structure they rely on would collapse. So they choose the only way they know how to keep existing. Sever the connection, neutralize memory, and treat you as if you never truly existed. And here is the most important truth that must be stated plainly, that coldness carries no information about your worth. It only reflects the fragility of the inner world on the other side. You were not discarded because you did not love enough. You were left because your presence began to require them to become a real human being, and that is something they cannot do. Part 1, discard, is not a breakup, but a psychological mechanism. The first thing that must be corrected, otherwise the entire story will always be misunderstood, is this. A narcissist does not break up with you in the way people normally understand separation. They do not leave because they are sad, because they are in pain, or because love has run out. Those motivations require an inner life capable of feeling, of regret, and of taking responsibility for attachment. What happens here is far colder than that. This is not the ending of a relationship, but the deactivation of an element within their psychological system. Within the inner structure of a narcissist, people do not exist as independent subjects with their own emotional lives, but as roles assigned value based on function. They do not ask, "Who is this person?" but unconsciously ask, "What does this person do for me?" When you enter their life, you do not enter as a human being to be met and bonded with, but as a component that keeps the system stable. You soothe emotional fluctuations they cannot self-regulate. You reflect an image of worth and specialness they need to believe is real. You shield the primal shame buried very early on. And above all, you help keep the persona, the image they present to the world, from collapsing. As long as you fully perform these functions, the relationship is maintained, not because of deep attachment, but because the system is operating efficiently. That is why discard does not happen when you are not good enough, but when you no longer function correctly in the role. Perhaps you begin to feel exhausted from always understanding for two people. Perhaps you need real reciprocity instead of pre-programmed empty gestures. Perhaps you ask questions, express needs, or simply stop turning yourself into a container for the instability they cannot face within themselves. For a healthy mind, these are signs of maturity, real connection, and relational growth. But for a narcissist, they are alarm bells. In Jungian psychology, the narcissist's ego is anchored by the persona, a mask sustained entirely by continuous external reflection. That persona does not exist independently. It requires mirrors, and you are one of the most important mirrors. When you change, when you no longer reflect the image they need to believe is real, the mirror begins to distort. And when the reflection falters, a survival threat emerges. If they stay, they will be forced to see what lies behind the mask, an unintegrated void, a primal shame never named, and the terrifying sense that there is no solid self inside to rely on. Faced with that threat, discard is no longer a moral or emotional choice. It becomes a survival reflex. Instead of confronting, they cut off. Instead of adjusting themselves, they eliminate the element that destabilizes the system. You are not left as a human being with memories and emotions. You are switched off like a function that no longer fits. This is precisely why their departure feels so cold, it borders on the inhuman. In that moment, you are no longer perceived as a person with an inner life, but as a component removed so the remaining illusion can continue to stand. Not because you were unworthy of love, but because that structure was never built to love a real human being. Part 2. Why discard is always accompanied by cruel coldness. Once it is understood that discard is not a breakup, but a psychological mechanism, the next question becomes unavoidable. Why can they leave so coldly, so quickly, and so decisively, as if all shared memories were erased in an instant? The answer lies in a truth that is rarely confronted directly. The narcissist's coldness is not a sign of emotional strength, but the expression of a numbness that has become a survival instinct. It is not resilience, and certainly not advanced self-control. It is the only way they know to keep their inner structure from collapsing. At a deep psychological level, a narcissist does not experience loss the way a person with a stable ego does. For them, emotions are not processed or integrated. They are blocked at the threshold of consciousness. Sadness, regret, guilt, or grief are not merely uncomfortable states, they are existential threats. Because if those emotions were allowed to exist, they would trigger a question the narcissist cannot tolerate. If I lose this person, then what inside me is falling apart? And that question exposes an even more dangerous truth, that their sense of self has never stood on its own without external reflection. That is why, instead of feeling, they freeze. Instead of hurting, they withdraw from emotion. Instead of staying to face the rupture of a connection, they sever it to preserve the illusion of wholeness. Seen this way, discard is not random callousness, but an emergency maneuver designed to prevent the psychological system from tipping into panic. This is also why discard is often accompanied by behaviors that leave the other person stunned. No explanation, no closure, no conversation real enough to end things properly. The sudden disappearance is not meant to punish you, nor is it a victory. It is the fastest way to shut down the emotions rising inside them. Every additional word, every backward glance, every acknowledgement of shared memory carries the risk of cracking the mask they are desperately trying to hold together. And when the persona is no longer just a social facade, but the only thing that allows them to feel they exist, protecting it becomes the absolute priority, even at the cost of appearing inhuman in the way they leave. The paradox is this, that very coldness is often misinterpreted as proof that they never loved you. But the deeper and more painful truth is different. They are not capable of loving in the way you understand love. Not because you were unworthy, but because their inner structure is not safe enough to remain in a connection that requires sustained emotional presence. They may crave being needed, admired, and leaned on as a source of stability, but they cannot tolerate real intimacy where they can no longer hide behind a role. When a relationship reaches that depth, coldness flips on like a survival switch, not to abandon you, but to rescue the illusion of who they believe themselves to be. Part 3. Your pain does not come from the discard, but from the truth that was just revealed. What wounds you most deeply is not the moment they leave, but but the feeling that everything you lived through with them suddenly loses its sense of reality. You do not just lose a person, you lose the belief that the bond itself was ever real in the human sense of a meeting between two souls. When discard happens, your brain does not respond only with grief, but with existential disorientation. If what you felt, invested in, and trusted can be erased so easily, then what in your life is still reliable? In ordinary relationships, separation is a process. It allows memories to be reorganized, emotions to be digested, and the ego to gradually accept loss. But a narcissist's discard is a brutal cut into psychological time. It does not close a chapter. It tears the book in half mid-page, leaving you trapped in a story with no ending. It is this absence of structure that causes your pain to linger, repeat itself, and turn into obsession. At a deeper level, this pain comes from a fundamental difference in how the two of you were present in the relationship. You loved by being there. You felt, you remembered, you responded. You allowed the other person to touch your most vulnerable inner layers. For you, the relationship was a living space where two people changed together. For the narcissist, the relationship was a mechanism for stabilizing the ego, a reflective system that helped them maintain control and a sense of existence. When that mechanism stops working, they feel no grief, because they never entered the relationship from the same level of reality. This creates a painful paradox. You hurt because you were truly there, and they do not hurt because they never allowed themselves to be. That imbalance makes you feel as though you are the only one carrying responsibility for the entire relationship. You carry the memories of two people, the emotions of two people, and the questions that should have been faced by both. From a philosophical perspective, this is the moment one must confront a difficult truth. Not every encounter happens between two equal subjects. In some relationships, you enter as a whole human being, while the other enters as a structure seeking stability. When that structure withdraws, it carries no guilt, because guilt exists only where there is moral responsibility toward another person. And this is precisely what hurts the most, not that they are cruel, but that they are not sufficiently present to be accountable. At an even deeper level, your pain is tied to a very human belief that love, if it is real enough, will be recognized. You believe that sincerity, patience, and the ability to see another person's potential were universal values. Discard forces you to confront the possibility that these values are not always shared. And that moment does not just shatter a relationship, it fractures your worldview. Yet, it is exactly at this point of collapse that another truth begins to emerge. The pain you carry is not evidence that you loved wrongly. It is evidence that you loved from a very real place. You hurt because you have the capacity for attachment, the capacity to stay, the capacity to allow another person into your inner life. And in a world where many survive behind masks, that capacity is not weakness, it is a rare form of presence. Discard does not take that value away. It only reveals that you offered it to someone who could not receive it. Part 4. It was never about you, the hardest truth to accept. There is a phrase that sounds comforting, yet feels almost impossible to believe when you have just been discarded. It was never about you. Because if it was not about you, then why are you the one left holding the pain, the memories, the unanswered questions? The deeper truth is this. You were not removed because you were lacking, but because you reached a limit their psychological structure could not cross. In the inner world of a narcissist, every relationship revolves around a single axis, maintaining control and preserving the false coherence of the ego. You enter their life not as a person to be understood, but as a factor that keeps the system running smoothly. When you loved, you believed you were building intimacy. For them, it was simply a phase in which the system functioned efficiently. And when the system began to destabilize, discard occurred as a technical operation, not a moral decision. What makes the phrase "never about you" so difficult to swallow is that you were genuinely present. You invested emotion, time, memory, and hope into the relationship. But from their side, what you brought was not linked to you as an independent subject, but to the function you performed. When that function no longer met their psychological needs, you became a variable that had to be removed so the system could return to equilibrium. At a deeper level, discard often happens precisely when you begin to mature within the relationship. You are no longer easily molded. You no longer automatically regulate their emotions. You begin to ask questions, request reciprocity, or simply stop turning yourself into a container for instability they cannot process. For a healthy mind, this is development. For a narcissist, it is a threat. In Jungian terms, this is the moment when you no longer reflect their persona unconditionally. The image they need to believe is real is no longer reinforced, and the shadow begins to emerge. Instead of confronting that shadow, they eliminate the trigger. You are not abandoned because you did something wrong, but because your presence began to require them to see themselves. So when it is said, "It was never about you," it does not invalidate your pain. It simply places that pain in its proper context. You were not discarded because you were insufficient, but because you outgrew a role they could control. You were not left behind because you lacked value, but because you began to become a real human being in a relationship designed only to preserve illusion. And the greatest paradox is this: the moment you believe you were rejected is the very moment you no longer belong to a structure that never made room for truth in the first place. Part 5. What actually happens inside them after discard. From the outside, after discard, a narcissist often appears to have moved on very quickly. They may surface with a new person, a new life, an image that looks brighter and more stable than ever. That image is what causes many victims to suffer even more, because it reinforces a cruel belief that you are the only one affected, while they remain completely untouched. But when we look into the psychological structure more closely, the truth is the opposite. Discard does not bring peace to a narcissist. It only creates a false pause. When you leave their system, what they lose is not love, but an internal regulatory anchor. You once served as a container for emotions, a mirror for value, a buffer that helped them avoid confronting the inner void. When that anchor disappears, the emptiness does not automatically fill itself. It is merely covered, temporarily, by new sources of stimulation. This is why new supply often appears so quickly, not because they are ready for a new relationship, but because their system cannot remain in a state without reflection. The new person is not chosen for deep compatibility, but for their ability to recreate feelings of power, admiration, and being needed. Yet every new supply has a limit. No one reflects in the same way you did, because each relationship mirrors a different stage of the ego structure. As time passes, the differences begin to surface. The new person does not know which role to perform the way you once did. Old memories, though denied, still leak through the cracks of the persona. In Jungian psychology, this is when the shadow becomes more active, because a key defensive pillar has been removed. The narcissist may experience states they cannot make sense of: unexplained restlessness, irritability, obsessive comparison, or a sense of emptiness even while receiving attention. The paradox is that they rarely connect these states to losing you. Instead, they blame circumstances, the new person, or the world. Any fixation that appears does not take the form of healthy remorse, but of remote control, monitoring, comparing, or seeking confirmation that you have not truly escaped them. Not because they miss you as a person, but because their system has not accepted the loss of an important mirror. And here an uncomfortable truth emerges. Discard does not free the narcissist from the relationship. It only pushes them into another loop of the same structure. There is no growth, no integration, only replacement. While you are doing the painful work of facing real emotion, They are busy maintaining the illusion that everything is fine. But the longer that illusion is sustained, the harder the inner emptiness becomes to hide. And no matter how many new sources of supply they pass through, the truth remains unchanged. No one can replace the function you once served, because the problem was never the person they chose, but the structure they have never dared to confront. Part 6. And what about you? Discard as a threshold of transformation. After the questions about them gradually run dry, another question begins to surface quietly, but inevitably. What about me? Unlike the narcissist, you cannot numb your emotions and continue living as if nothing happened. You are forced to move through the pain. And that path, though brutal, opens a threshold of transformation you never chose but must cross. Discard forces you to face the truth that you invested too much life energy into a relationship where reciprocity never truly existed. You begin to recognize that much of what you called love was in fact adaptive reflex. Trying to understand, trying to endure, trying to keep the peace, trying to believe for two people. When the relationship collapses, those reflexes have no object left to attach to, and you are compelled to return to yourself. In Jungian language, this is the moment the process of individuation begins, not as an ideal, but as a survival necessity. You can no longer remain a mirror for another when you yourself are exhausted. You cannot continue sacrificing yourself to sustain an illusion. Their withdrawal, painful as it is, has inadvertently severed the unconscious contract that made you equate your worth with endurance and the rescue of others. At this stage, many people confuse healing with returning. They believe that if they understand enough, forgive enough, or love in a better way, the story can be rewritten. But true maturity begins when you realize that not every relationship needs another chapter. Some relationships exist only to expose old patterns that have reached their end. Seen this way, discard is no longer just a loss. It becomes a boundary drawn cruelly but clearly between continuing to live as a function and returning to life as a whole human being. You begin to reclaim the energy you placed in the wrong place, not through resentment, but through emotional separation. You learn not to react, not to explain, not to prove. And in that silence, a new form of sovereignty slowly takes shape. The most important thing to say here is this: discard does not diminish your value. It forces you to redefine your value without requiring anyone's reflection. When you stop trying to be seen by someone who is incapable of seeing, you begin to see yourself. And the paradox is that the moment you stop seeking closure from them is the moment you find a deeper kind of closure, not for that relationship, but for the version of you who once believed they had to trade themselves away in order to stay. Part 7. The final truth. They have no ending, but you do. At this point, there is a truth that must be stated plainly, without softening it, without romanticizing it. A narcissist does not have an ending in the way people often hope for. There is no clear moment of awakening, no complete apology, no remorse that leads to healing. What exists instead is the continuation of the same structure, the same mechanism, the same loop, repeated with different people in different contexts. And if you are still waiting for an ending from them in order to feel at peace, that very waiting is the final thread keeping you tied to the system that harmed you. In-depth psychology, especially through a Jungian lens, change occurs only when the ego can tolerate the truth about itself. For a narcissist, that truth is too dangerous. It threatens the entire persona structure they rely on to exist. So, instead of moving through shadow integration, they choose to keep running, keep replacing, keep reconstructing the same story in different forms. Not because they are evil, but because they lack the inner foundation required to stop. You, however, despite never choosing this path, are pushed in a different direction. You do have an ending not because the story with them is repaired, but because you are capable of closing from within. You can carry memory without letting it define you. You can face truth without denying it or distorting it in order to survive. And this is the fundamental difference between a living human being and a structure that merely operates. True liberation does not come from them finally recognizing you. It comes from you no longer needing them to. When you stop waiting for an explanation, for validation, or for a moment when they turn back, you step out of the loop, not through a loud victory, but through a quiet withdrawal from a stage that was never meant for you. And this is the final paradox of discard. What they use to save themselves becomes the door through which you are freed. They continue living in repetition, while you move into a different order of life, one where value no longer needs to be reflected, where your presence is not a function for someone else, and where real closure does not come from someone returning, but from the moment you choose to stand on your own side. When you look back on this entire journey, perhaps the most important thing to carry with you is not resentment, nor the question of how they could be so cold, but a clear understanding of what truly occurred. You were not left because you lacked value, nor replaced because you were not good enough. You were discarded because you stepped out of the invisible role they needed you to maintain. And when you no longer reflected in the way their system required, that system had to remove you to preserve itself. This truth can be painful, but it is also liberating. It lifts the burden of self-blame, of fixing the past, of trying to become enough for someone who was never seeking truth. In its place, it returns to you the right to see yourself clearly, as a person who was genuinely present, who genuinely loved, and who paid a very human price for that presence. If there is one thing discard cannot take away, it is your capacity to feel, to attach, to enter a relationship with your whole being. These qualities were not mistakes. They simply needed to be placed in the right space with the right person. And when you stop seeking validation from a structure incapable of love, you begin to open space for a different kind of connection, one where your presence does not require the disappearance of yourself. Finally, remember this. They leave in silence to avoid facing the truth about who they are, while you remain with the pain in order to have the chance to become more real. And in this world, that is not failure. It is the beginning of a life no longer defined by whether someone stays or leaves, but by the fact that you chose not to abandon yourself.